Right, welcome everyone. Today we're finally going to put together aggregate supply and aggregate demand and come up with macroeconomic equilibrium. Isn't that exciting? It's not going to be terribly different from what you're used to, and you can probably guess the impact of putting the two graphs together. Don't forget that national income is pretty much how productive or healthy an economy is. So the higher the national output is, or the income level, the better off a country is doing. When we look at the interaction between aggregate supply and aggregate demand, we are simply just looking at what point aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. So remember now, on the supply side especially, there are varying graphs between short run versus long run. So as a result, in equilibrium, we also have to separate short run equilibrium versus long run because the graphs are going to look a little bit different. So short run equilibrium output looks very similar to our microeconomic supply and demand curve. At equilibrium, it's where the short run aggregate supply meets the aggregate demand. So we would always produce this price and this amount of real output. So don't forget your labeling when it comes to macroeconomics. All right. So instead of P and Q, you're going to have average price level and real output, or Y. And then for your curves, short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve instead of S and D. All right, so labeling is very important. Don't forget your labeling conventions. So this is a nice, comfortable level. Because the aggregate demand is equal to the aggregate supply, there's no upward or downward pressure on the price level. So everyone's quite happy with that price, and the demand is being met at a price that can be willing and able to be paid by the consumers. So as long as nothing changes, the aggregate demand and supply, the economy just kind of chills there at equilibrium. The long run, on the other hand, remember we have two different perspectives. There is a disagreement among what in the long run the supply curve looks like. So demand is still fairly similar. So you can see here that it's a downward facing slope, right? Because once again, we know that as price increases, the quantity demanded ends up starting to teeter, right? It starts to level off because we like to buy things cheaper, don't we, as consumers? So in the new classical perspective, remember, it looks at full employment where it's a straight line. So the elasticity of this is completely inelastic. It doesn't matter what the price is, you're always going to be having the same amount of real output under any price circumstance. So when you draw the supply and demand curve, you can see equilibrium rests once again at full income output, right? Full employment of income output. So the impact of any changes on aggregate demand will be on the price level only. So you can see in 16.3, if there's a shift, right? Any reason for demand to shift, you're going to see that. So let's say, for example, something occurs where it increases the demand of something, right? There would be a shift to the right, and look what happens to the price level. We go from P1 at the original AD1 up to P2 at AD2 because there's more demand now. So obviously prices will have to rise because there's still the same amount of resources, right? The real output remains the same. So the new classical perspective shows a combination of the short run and long run, and you can definitely see it illustrated in the two models. Okay, so in the short run, let's explain what happens, because 16.4 kind of demonstrates how this step occurs, right? Because it doesn't necessarily immediately result in a shift in price. So let's say, for example, at the beginning, this is our equilibrium point, right? You have your long run aggregate supply curve and then your initial demand curve. What happens is that in the short run, this is what your supply curve looks like. There's a shift in demand, right? This is the new level of output. So when there's demand in the short run, there's going to be a slight increase in output. This could be due to slight excess capacity. Sometimes you pay a little bit of overtime, right? So you have a little bit of resources without increasing your factors of production and things like that. where by paying overtime you can temporarily increase your output to meet the new demand. So it's going to shift from Y1 to Y2. In this case, the economy is experiencing what is known as an inflationary gap. So we're producing above the full employment level, right? So inflationary gap is when you're above. A deflationary gap is actually if you went the opposite direction, where there's a decrease in demand and we're actually producing under full employment in the long run. All right. So the inflationary gap is then created. So you're producing a higher level than full employment level of output. However, in the new classical economist model, this only lasts in the short run. It's possible for output to increase in the short run by paying the overtime and wages and things like that. But the economy is originally at the full employment level of output, so there's no unemployed resources, all right? And that's why eventually you're going to have a scarcity of labor. You're not going to be able to produce at that level for very long. Obviously, the diagram shows an increase in demand resulting in an increase in price level, which is going to then shift to P1. So this graph here demonstrates, so step one was a shift in the demand curve. Step two was then, because of the increased expenses and the lack of resources, you see a shift in the supply curve in the short run, which takes us right here to where we originally ended up on the full employment of output. So due to the pressures of constraints, limitations of resources, things like that, you actually see, so in the short run initially, you do see a little bit of increased output, and then the supply curve shifts as costs start increasing and factors of production are limited, which brings us right back to the level. So that takes us all the way back to the first graph. So can you see how that happens? Why in the short run there is a temporary increase in output, but then eventually it corrects itself. So once again, this is in the new classical model. So you can see a lot of similar analysis happens if aggregate demand falls. So this graph here looks at demand falling for whatever reason, and we know all the reasons that shift demand left or right. So you can see here that there's a deflationary gap that's initially created. So our real level of output goes from YF, right, which is at full employment, down to Y1. In this case, the economy will be experiencing that deflationary gap where the economy isn't working at the equilibrium level of output. It's less than the full employment. So in the short run, the economy is going to produce less than it can, but it doesn't persist. The factors of production have fallen, right? This means that the firm's costs have fallen. So there's going to be a shift now to the right of your supply curve. So in response to prices, factors of production costs falling, there's now a shift to the right because it's now cheaper to produce, so they're going to increase their quantity. So what you have is in the short run, so initially this level where you're under, and then what happens is a shift to the right that, guess what, brings us back to our full employment, but at a lower price level. So it goes all the way back again to this, where you can go up and down in prices depending on the shifts in the long run. There is a little bit of movement in the short run in terms of quantity where you fall off of full employment, but eventually the pressures from the suppliers, whether to increase or decrease their production due to factors of production costs, bring it right back. So it's fairly straightforward, right? You get it? So there's usually a shift in the demand in the short run, and then eventually a shift in the supply in the short run, bringing us right back to full employment. And this is the new classical model. Let's look at the Keynesian perspective, all right? So the Keynesian has a very different look at equilibrium. The Keynesian takes place before we even see any kind of increase in output. So this is really interesting because it never, in the Keynesian model, we never reach full employment. You can see here that even in the long run, we stop right here at this point. Why? And so there's constantly a deflationary gap, even at equilibrium. We're never quite at that level of production. If aggregate demand is the same level that's shown in 16.8 right here, all right, the equilibrium will occur at a real output of Y with a price level of P. So in the previous chapter, aggregate supply, was perfectly elastic because of the existence of spare capacity. So that's why there was no growth initially. You could continue to produce more, right, for a long period of time because you have excess capacity. You don't have to start paying or increase your factors of production because you've got all these spare labor, spare resources, all that fun stuff, right? So in the previous chapter, you can also, don't forget about the production possibility curve. So when you have spare capacity, it's like you're producing at A. So you have all of this ability to actually reach, this would be like more of a full employment if you hit the line. So we're always within there. So we say that there's a deflationary gap where the level of aggregate demand in the economy is never sufficient enough to buy up the potential output that you can make. So in the Keynesian model, we never actually reach full potential initially. So this can also be referred to as an output gap. So it's either deflationary gap or output gap because we're not producing our full amount. This is once again a picture of it on a PPF where you can see that there's still ways to go before you reach your limits of output. In the Keynesian view, aggregate demand can increase so that there's an increase in level of real output without any consequent increase in the price level. So you can see here a shift in aggregate demand to the right, and look, we're still at the same price because we didn't have any increased factors of production, so there was no need for any shift. So we went from Y1 to Y2 as a result of a shift from AD1 to AD2. However, in the end, there really was no significant change. There was no change at all in the price. Now, if aggregate demand increases even further, so another level, then you can see here in 16.11, we're starting now to dip into our spare capacity. So you're going to experience some inflationary pressure because now costs are starting to rise. The production is becoming more scarce, right? There's less resources to make. So the price levels are going to start to rise up from P1 to P2. So we're getting closer. Our deflationary gap is now shrinking a little bit. If the economy is operating at full employment, then there's an increase in aggregate demand. The outcome will be purely inflationary. So if we ever get to this point, the outcome is purely inflationary. That means that there's actually no increase in output, only the change in the price level. So even though the price is going up at that point, you're not creating more because normally price increasing would mean an increase for suppliers or more incentive for suppliers to produce. But because you've reached full employment, it's just inflation. Price is going up, but there's not actually more sales taking place. So an increase in aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2 here results in no change in output in the economy because once again, we've reached full employment. The only impact is an increase in price level. So there's definitely an inflationary gap. So it's only at this point that you see where inflation really starts to take over, that there's an inflationary gap. Before that, it's mostly a deflationary gap in the Keynesian model. So that's how supply and demand shifts with the two different models in the long run. So the main point is to remember that initially, any change in demand actually wouldn't change the price, and because equilibrium in a Keynesian model is set well before inflation starts to take place, because there's the idea that we have spare capacity and we don't work initially at full employment, and it's only at the very end of the curve that we finally reach full employment, and then it's just purely inflation as there's shifts in demand. Got it? Not too difficult in my opinion. Let me know if there's anything confusing. I do want to go over some demand side policies, a couple other things before we close this. I know it's a long video, but my apologies. So the diagrams and explanations illustrate the Keynesian perspective of different possible long-run positions of the economy, right? What's really important is the conclusion that long-run equilibrium of output does not really always equal full employment level of income, and that the economy actually can be stuck in equilibrium at a level of output that's below full employment. so the economy can rest and be comfortable at a level that isn't at full employment. That's why in the Keynesian model, you say that, well, governments have to step in. We're not working at full employment. We have spare capacity and we're not getting to it. The demand and supply are settling before they need to. So that's why the Keynesian model have government intervention, while in the new classical model believes in no government intervention, because the economy reaches full employment on its own. So the fiscal and monetary policies that we introduced back in chapter 14 are examples of ways of igniting demand by increasing or decreasing taxes, by increasing or decreasing government spending, those are the two fiscal policies, or by increasing and decreasing interest rates, which is monetary policy. You can play with demand and help push the economy reach full employment. So the increasing level of output implies an increase in the demand for labor, and so policies are then designed to, in some cases, reduce unemployment, right? So if inflation is getting really high, there's too much demand, resources are getting scarce, we need to try and make contractionary policies to make the economy smaller. If we need to increase our output, if we're below, we have a deflationary gap, expansionary policies are there, things that can increase demand. So lowering taxes, making more disposable income, lowering interest rates so people are actually taking out loans and buying stuff. So expansionary policies, trying to encourage more sales and more transactions and boost the economy. Contractionary policies are there to decrease aggregate demand, reducing the inflationary pressure, because high inflation is not good. People are paying lots more money for the same amount of thing without any main, added value to that. So let's take a look at changes in long-run aggregate supply. All right, changes in long-run aggregate supply. So remember, way back in chapter 15, wasn't that long ago, was it? A country's long-run aggregate supply is based on the quantity and quality of factors of production. Therefore, when you reach full employment, output is also going to change. So there could be instances where there's a shift if we have an increase in the quality or quantity of resources. So let's say you found a new natural resource, or there's improved technology, so there's better quality output, things like that. There could be a shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve. So a country seeking to increase the rate of growth, because remember, that's a huge objective, to grow, right? We want more goods and services being transacted. Remember, the health of the economy is measured by the national income. Growth is really important. So if a country is seeking to increase their rate of growth, full employment level of real output will use supply side policy to increase the quantity or improve its factors of production. So supply side policies are, once again, training, education, things like that, supporting new businesses. So by incorporating supply side policy, right, that is enough in one of the models to improve the economy, because you're going to improve the quality and quantity of natural resources, because with research comes discovery, more efficiency, with higher intelligence and education levels and things like that. Now, the Keynesian economists think differently. They think the impact of an increase in the long-run aggregate supply depends on the initial equilibrium position of the economy. So if the economy is operating below full employment, the increase in long aggregate supply is going to have no effect whatsoever on equilibrium output. So we saw that in 16.13 over here, right? So you can see that even if there's a shift in the supply curve, equilibrium is still the same, because remember, the equilibrium point occurs before the inflationary pressures exist. So in the Keynesian model, once again, they don't see really a huge impact of supply side policy, because if you improve the supply and create a shift in the economy, it doesn't actually change the demand. So the Keynesian model don't rate really supply side policy as much as the neoclassical model. So an increase in the long aggregate supply from a new classical viewpoint will have a very favorable impact, as you can see in the picture. So unlike the Keynesian model, when there's a shift, look what happens. the real output is increased and the price is decreased as a result. So that's why the new classical economists are actually referred to a lot of times as supply side economists, because they believe so strongly that these supply side policies are the most effective way of managing the economy. So that's less government intervention. So it's more about improving education, improving the people, the consumers, the suppliers, and not the government coming in and giving or paying less taxes or more taxes or playing around with inflation rates. Can you see the difference there? So look, once again, Keynesian model, any type of supply side policy creating a shift in supply, no impact on equilibrium, while there's a significant impact on equilibrium in the neoclassical model as we shift from this full level of employment to the new YF2, new full level of employment. So I hope that helped. I'm going to stop it right there because the next section is on the multiplier effect, which is HL only. So I'll do that in a separate video. Like, subscribe, join, and have a great day, guys. Take care.